At 18, my dad kicked me out for being useless. I still remember the look on his face, pride twisting into disgust, as he shoved a duffel bag into my hands and pointed toward the door. "Don't come back until you can prove you're worth something," he sneered. My mother sat silently in the corner, her eyes avoiding mine, as if my failure were already written in stone. I stepped into the cold night with nothing but the clothes on my back and the burning sting of betrayal. I had no plan, no friends to turn to, and no money to lean on. What I did have was stubbornness, a refusal to let his words define me. That night, as I walked aimlessly through the streets of our small town, I promised myself something. One day, he would see the person I was meant to be, and he would regret every harsh word. The first few months were brutal. I bounced between cheap apartments, part-time jobs, and people who barely noticed me. I waited tables, cleaned offices late into the night, and even delivered packages in the sweltering summer heat. I was invisible, ignored, mocked, and underestimated. But in that invisibility, I found a strange kind of freedom. I was no longer living under his shadow. I was free to build, to learn, and to grow. He never knew I survived those years, not just by working hard, but by observing. I studied the people around me, the businesses I encountered, the patterns of money and opportunity that my father had always dismissed as unnecessary or boring. By day, I was the girl no one paid attention to. By night, I was plotting, learning, and preparing for a life he couldn't imagine. By the time I turned 20, I stumbled across my first real opportunity, a rundown property with a stubborn owner and a price too low for anyone with sense. Everyone I asked laughed and said it was a waste of time, but I had learned patience and observation, and I invested what little I had. That first deal barely made a profit, but it ignited something in me. The power of turning nothing into something. Each small success built on the last. Every penny I saved, every late night spent researching, every odd job I took became a brick in a quiet empire I was constructing. My father thought I was failing, but with each passing year, I was quietly mastering the art of survival and power. I learned that patience and persistence often speak louder than brute force or wealth. People who had once ignored me began to see glimpses of change. Former classmates noticed the car I drove to interviews, though I made sure it didn't scream wealth, just quiet competence. My father, of course, never imagined that the child he called useless was quietly building a future that would one day eclipse everything he had achieved. One night, after returning from another grueling day at a cafe, I found a letter slipped under the door of my tiny apartment, a notice that I was behind on rent. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it reminded me how far I had come. They all thought I was struggling, weak, and dependent. Little did they know, I was already several steps ahead, laying the foundation for a life they could never touch. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was growing, learning, and planning. Every insult, every dismissal, every whispered joke at my expense became fuel. By the time I turned 25, I had quietly amassed a small portfolio of properties and investments. I still kept it secret. No one could know my full power. The world outside still saw me as a struggling young adult, but inside, I was unstoppable. And deep down, a seed of justice had been planted. One day, he would see me. Not the girl he thought he knew, not the failure he assumed I was, but the woman who had quietly become untouchable. The countdown had begun, and I wasn't as weak as anyone believed. They didn't just underestimate me. They enjoyed it. Whenever I returned to my hometown, whispers followed me like shadows. My father would parade his successful children, smirking when anyone mentioned me, as if I were already forgotten. Friends and distant relatives nodded along, their eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of watching someone they considered weak stumble. Every laugh, every glance, every subtle snub cut deep. Inside, it hurt more than I let anyone see. Nights were the worst. Alone in cheap motel rooms or tiny apartments, I would stare at the ceiling, wondering if I was truly destined to fail. The world seemed determined to remind me of my weakness, to confirm my father's cruel judgment. But each night of doubt passed, replaced by a steel-hard determination. I would not break. I would not beg for recognition. I would rise, quietly, invisibly, and on my own terms. I threw myself into work with relentless focus. Odd jobs, late-night shifts, and early mornings became my routine. I delivered packages in the heat, cleaned offices in the dark, and waited tables in endless cycles of exhaustion. But every task taught me something: discipline, patience, negotiation, observation. What my father saw as useless wandering was actually my apprenticeship in survival, strategy, and resilience. By my mid-20s, I had begun investing quietly. Small properties, undervalued stocks, and niche opportunities, all invisible to those who assumed I had nothing. No one suspected that the girl they mocked was secretly building a foundation for wealth and influence. I kept my success hidden, almost obsessively, because revealing it too soon would have spoiled the thrill of justice and the inevitability of the reveal. And then came the day that cemented my resolve. I overheard my father boasting to a business associate, claiming he would move into a neighborhood where no one could challenge him. He laughed at the notion of competition, unaware that the very mansion he dreamed of dominating was already mine. My name, signed on every deed, every contract, every legal document, untouchable, unassailable, and unknown to him. The irony was intoxicating. Even family gatherings were a battlefield. Cousins whispered, neighbors judged, and he smiled with smug arrogance, thinking I was still struggling to survive. I kept my head low, smiled politely, and nodded at every jab. No one saw the fire burning behind my eyes. No one knew that each insult, each dismissal, each laugh at my expense was being recorded, analyzed, and turned into fuel for the storm I was quietly preparing. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about proving, first to myself and then to the world, that I could rise from absolute nothingness. Every setback, every humiliation only made me stronger. I learned the value of patience, of silent observation, of preparing for the exact moment when the world would finally recognize my power. My father had planted seeds of cruelty, and I had cultivated them into strategy. I spent nights poring over investment books, legal documents, and financial strategies. I networked in secrecy, building alliances with people who had influence, connections, and the means to help me secure my future. No one knew my plans, and that was exactly how I wanted it. The element of surprise would be my ultimate weapon. By the time I was 28, I had quietly amassed a small empire of properties, investments, and allies. All of it remained under the radar, invisible to the eyes of those who thought they had power over me. And yet, in the back of my mind, the thought lingered. One day, he would step into my world, still unaware that the very ground beneath his feet was mine. The seed of justice had grown into a silent, unstoppable force. The girl who was called useless at 18 was no longer weak. I had endured pain, endured scorn, and endured betrayal. But I had also grown, learned, and prepared. The day of reckoning was approaching, and when it came, he would finally understand that underestimating me had been his greatest mistake. By the time I turned 29, I had quietly built a life my father could never have imagined. My properties, investments, and carefully cultivated alliances gave me control over spaces he thought he owned. But I didn't rush the reveal. Patience had taught me that the sweetest victory comes from anticipation, from letting the unsuspecting walk into their own undoing. It started with subtle invitations. "You should see the new neighborhood," I said casually to him during one of our rare, accidental encounters. His eyebrows lifted. "Really? I might check it out," he replied, voice dripping with self-assurance. He had no idea that he was stepping closer to the mansion already in my name. I offered directions, smiled politely, and let him believe he was exploring freely. Every detail was calculated. Every step he took was on my terms. Neighbors, carefully briefed but unaware of my true identity, played their part without knowing. They praised him politely, pointed out requirements for new residents, and guided him deeper into my carefully set-up web. I watched from a distance, heart steady, knowing that his arrogance would be his undoing. Every boast he made, every assumption about ownership, strengthened the trap I had built around him. I pretended to be a concierge, an estate assistant, a low-level manager, someone completely unremarkable. He laughed at my advice, mocked my demeanor, and assumed I had no authority. He believed the mansion would soon be his kingdom, his playground. Every smirk, every overconfident claim only tightened my control. In truth, he was walking into the fortress of my making, every inch legally mine, every door unlocked only for him to walk straight inside. While he plotted, I continued building quietly behind the scenes. Documents were updated, deeds finalized, and small but critical details were perfected. I ensured that when the moment came, he would have no escape, no leverage, no argument. The illusion of power was a fragile thing, and he had fallen right into it. Even as he boasted to friends and colleagues about his upcoming conquest, I smiled silently. He had no idea that the girl he dismissed as useless had orchestrated every step of this encounter. Every plan, every investment, every late-night decision had led to this moment. I wasn't just winning. I was rewriting the story he thought he controlled. Finally, the day of the confrontation arrived. I scheduled a viewing to finalize paperwork, ensuring he would be present and eager. I guided him through the mansion, each room a testament to my hidden rise. Chandeliers sparkled, furniture gleamed, and subtle signs of wealth and influence were everywhere. But he never connected it to me. He believed the house was a prize he would soon claim, oblivious that the very empire he sought to dominate was already under my control. I remained calm, polite, almost deferential. Each step, each nod, each comment reinforced the illusion. He bragged, misstepped, and strutted through my mansion, unaware that every move he made tightened the chain of his own humiliation. The trap was nearly complete. He was walking straight into the moment of revelation I had so carefully constructed. As we reached the final room, I handed him a set of documents with an unassuming smile. "Just the final signatures," I said. The pause before he read them stretched like a heartbeat in slow motion. His confident smirk began to falter. I could see it. Disbelief mingling with confusion. The mansion, the neighborhood, the empire he thought he would claim. It was mine. Every line on every paper bore my name. Every legal obstacle in his way had been cleared by my careful, quiet preparation. In that frozen moment, I felt a surge of triumph I had dreamed about for over a decade. The boy my father had once mocked, the girl the world had dismissed, had outsmarted the man who thought he was untouchable. The final confrontation was imminent. He had no clue that he had walked directly into the storm I had been preparing for years. The final moment arrived faster than he could anticipate. I handed him the documents with a calm, polite smile. "Just the final signatures," I said, my voice steady, almost casual. His eyes flicked to the deed, and then froze. The confident smirk that had carried him through years of arrogance faltered. This can't be. This is my father's property?" he stammered, disbelief and panic mingling in his tone. I let the pause linger, letting the weight of reality settle. "Actually," I said, savoring each word, "it's mine. Every line, every square inch, legally untouchable. All in my name." His face went pale. Rage, confusion, and shock warred across his features. "You... How?" he sputtered. I tilted my head, smiling with quiet triumph. "Saved every penny, invested smartly, turned every insult, every humiliation, every word that you ever spoke against me into this." Neighbors had gathered quietly, curious about the commotion. They whispered to each other, their eyes widening as they realized the truth. The man who had strutted in with arrogance, thinking he was about to claim dominance, was powerless. And I, the girl he had called useless, the one he had kicked out, stood as the undeniable owner of the mansion, the empire, and the proof of his greatest miscalculation. He stammered, flailing for excuses, for some way to regain control, but there was none. Every argument, every boast, every claim of entitlement crumbled against the mountain of evidence I had built in silence. The very ground he had thought was his playground was mine, legally and morally untouchable. He had walked into my world unprepared, arrogant, and blind, and I had waited patiently for this moment. I handed him a final note, letting my words land with precision. "Next time," I said, voice soft but cutting, "think twice before underestimating someone." His shoulders slumped, pride shattered, ego in ruins. He left humiliated, exposed, and powerless. The neighbors, silent witnesses to the unraveling of his arrogance, whispered among themselves, stunned by the poetic justice they had just witnessed. For the first time in years I laughed, loud, victorious, unstoppable. The world saw me as the quiet girl who had once been kicked out, struggling and invisible. But I knew the truth. I had endured pain, rejection, and relentless judgment, and I had emerged stronger, smarter, and untouchable. Every insult, every dismissal, every moment of mockery had fueled a meticulous rise to power. At 18, I was useless. At 28, I was untouchable. The girl who had left home with nothing had built a life, a legacy, and a revenge that could not be denied. My father's ego, his assumptions, his arrogance, they had all been tools I used to construct this victory. He never saw it coming because he never respected the quiet strength he had dismissed. As he disappeared from the driveway, shoulders hunched and dignity in ruins, I felt a calm satisfaction wash over me. The years of struggle, the silent growth, the hidden planning, they all converged in this single moment. I had the last laugh. I had rewritten my story, and the girl he had dismissed was now the woman he could never undermine. I walked through my mansion, each room a testament to patience, resilience, and intelligence. This was more than revenge. It was proof that underestimation is dangerous, that quiet strength can move mountains, and that justice, when served with precision, is sweeter than any fleeting triumph. At 18, I left home with nothing. At 28, I had everything, and the man who had rejected me had nothing but regret. He had finally learned the lesson I had lived every day: never underestimate the person you once called useless. And in that lesson, I had the final, unshakable victory.